All right, let's get this started. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Okay. I'm here to tell you a little bit about building apps with tvOS. A little bit of backstory. My name is Tim Johnsen. I work at Pinterest. I've been at Pinterest for about 9 months now. Prior to Pinterest, I worked at a company called Flipboard for about 4 years. And I also create side projects. I'm actually deeply passionate about side projects. I feel like that's a great avenue for people to learn new things, basically, and experiment with what they might not otherwise be able to experiment with. So I create side projects under this alias called TJ, which is the first 2 letters of my first name and the first 2 letters of my last name. And one of those side projects is this. So I built an app last October called Tangent. Tangent is an Instagram client for tvOS, for the new Apple TV. It came out with the Apple TV last year. It was available on day 1, and I'm very proud of it. And so, I don't know, I had a great experience building this app. I really enjoyed it a lot. And so I'm here to talk about this. I'm here to talk about the Apple TV because I believe it's a great platform, and I think that there's a lot of untapped potential that the developer community could get from it. And I believe, like the other Tim said, that the future of TV is apps. I think he said this a few times in a few different keynotes. So contrasting tvOS with iOS, talk about some of the benefits of the platform. First of all, the APIs are very familiar. tvOS is built on top of UIKit and Objective-C or Swift, whichever your preference is. So if you're an iOS developer, you should feel right at home on this platform. There shouldn't be that many surprises. The hardware is very fast. I don't know what exact iOS device it equates to, but these things are like really, really performant. If you're building software on these, it's like super duper quick. They're very easy to debug. If you've debugged an iOS app, again, this will be very familiar. There's a simulator, there's a tvOS simulator that operates exactly like the iOS simulator. And to debug an actual hardware, you just plug a cable in and debug it as you would an iOS app. So it should be very familiar. It's a USB-C cable, but I heard that that's cool these days. So, if you're fortunate enough to get a developer kit, which I don't believe they're giving away anymore, it came with a USB-C cable, which is convenient. If you didn't get one of those, you have to go buy one. And they're very affordable. They're like $100. With the holidays coming around, I bet a lot of people will be getting these as Christmas presents. I bet a lot of people got them last year as Christmas presents as well, or replace Christmas with whichever holiday you prefer. So that's nice. And it's also a new platform, or it's a relatively new platform. It's about a year old now, but like I said, I still think that there's a whole lot of untapped potential in this platform. And again, with the holidays coming around, a lot of people are probably going to want to be installing apps once they get one of these things. So contrasting this with another platform that Apple launched last year, so I built a couple watchOS apps. watchOS is a very different story. The APIs are very unfamiliar. You have to work in this like WK interface system, and you have to use storyboards, and it's split across an extension and like storyboard. It's very strange. The hardware is ridiculously slow. I haven't used a new watchOS device. I hear they're faster, but I have my original Apple Watch. It's really slow. They're painful to debug because to debug them, you actually have to debug through your phone with a Bluetooth connection to the watch, which is kind of annoying. And you have to provision both your iOS device and the watch, which is kind of a pain in the butt. They're very expensive. Oh no, I've gone backwards. They're very expensive, but they're also a new platform. So, and I feel like the watchOS got a whole ton of adoption and spotlight when it came out, and the tvOS didn't get so much. So I hope that we can build some great stuff for it. So what do I mean when I talk about familiar APIs? I mentioned that tvOS is... Did this just stop? Okay. It's basically UIKit, so a lot of things that you see in UIKit are going to be very familiar to you. Notably, a lot of the core view controllers that you might use are around. So first of all, tab bar controllers. A lot of these components are just reskinned for tvOS, but they're literally exactly the same. So this is a UI tab bar controller on iOS and a UI tab bar controller on tvOS. They look a little bit different, but they operate largely the same. The next is navigation controllers. So there's a few differences between navigation controllers on tvOS and on iOS. Most notably, navigation controllers on tvOS don't have a navigation bar. The menu button on the Siri remote becomes your implicit back button. And if you want any sort of top Chrome, you have to create your own. But this is literally a push and a pop on a navigation controller. So very, very common and familiar to people. Next is split view controllers. If you've done a lot of iPad development or iOS development on the iPhone 7 Plus or 6 Plus, or yeah, then you'll be more familiar with split view controllers. They play a bigger role on tvOS because the screens on TVs are very wide. So it's very common to use a split view controller to get this pattern where there's sort of detailed information on the right and something on the left. And alert controllers, which are how you present alerts as of, I think it was iOS 8 or 9 on iOS. You use alert controllers on tvOS as well. I should note that UI Alert View is not available on tvOS, whereas it's just deprecated in iOS. It might be completely gone now. I don't know about iOS 10, but you use alert controllers to pop up alerts, so people know about that. Some of our favorite things from iOS are, however, not available on tvOS, or not issues that you might bump into on tvOS, which makes me really happy. So for example, dealing with the status bar, biggest pain in the butt. I hate working with the status bar. There's no status bar on tvOS. Device rotation. People do not rotate their devices, so that's not something you have to deal with. Slow, bad network connections. You should still build your app so that it's resilient to crappy network conditions. But these things are stationary and they have like a pretty persistent either Wi-Fi or Ethernet connection. So you're going to have way fewer kind of networking headaches. And then multiple screen sizes. Right now, the tvOS only supports a single screen size, which is 1080p television. You could see them introducing something new in the future, so that this is not an excuse to just hard code one screen size in the apps you develop, but it's way less of a headache than iOS, where there's like a vast array of screen sizes. You can also create universal tvOS and iOS apps, and so if you decide to do that, you're going to have the same problem, where this is just yet another screen size tacked onto your app. But yeah, and these are around. So that's cool. It's sort of like, I think of tvOS as iOS without a lot of the cruft that has accumulated in it over the past few years, which is cool. So I'm going to talk about a few things today that actually make tvOS different from iOS, things that I feel like are fundamental to building a great tvOS app, and I hope that it's educational for everybody to go out and build stuff. The first thing is the focus system. So on tvOS, you use one of these things. This is a Siri remote. This is how you interact with an Apple TV. It has a handful of buttons and a trackpad that acts kind of like a Mac trackpad. Whereas on iOS, we're very used to touch interactions. That's how everything is driven. So the focus system is actually how people use this to navigate the OS. Since they can't walk up and touch their TV, you use the trackpad to navigate around, and the focus system is what drives this. This is how you build interfaces in tvOS that people can interact with. The focus system is comprised of just a few core components. The way I've structured this is I'm going to go through like the detailed version of it, but then in the end, I'm going to recommend a bunch of system components that already exist. And I would advise you to use the system components because Apple builds them and maintains them, and they're great already. But I want to give the full kind of picture of how the focus system works. So first of all, there's two key protocols in the focus system. The first is UI focus environment. You can think of something that conforms to UI focus environment as a sort of focus container. So it itself is not an element that is focusable, but it's something that can have focusable children. So it declares sort of where focus should go, what the preferred focus is, and if focus changes, things that conform to this are told about those changes. The next is UI focus item, which is another protocol. UI view conforms to UI focus item. So if you're using any UI views in tvOS, they all conform to focus item already. The default on views for them being focusable is no. So the most important thing here is they say whether or not they can become focused or not through this method. The default is no, but like UI control and all of its subclasses, for example, are focusable by default. And then third is this UI focus update context class. So in the event that focus moves around, and it does a lot, you are passed one of these objects, and this contains information about changes in focus. So you use this to update your UI in response to focus changes. So first thing I want to talk about is detecting focus changes. This is something you'll probably want to do commonly if you use change in focus to change something else in your UI. So in order to detect focus change, it's really easy. There's a method you override from UI focus environment. And this cascades up the view hierarchy. So you could respond to this like in the window or in a view controller's view. It doesn't have to be like deep in the view hierarchy, but there's a method you override, which is did update focus in context. This will be called whenever focus changes, and it gives you an animation coordinator, which is handy if you need to perform animations along with the change. So in this case, a very contrived example, but I've got my I'm basically logging the focus changes as focus changes, and here I have two focusable elements, a button and a custom view that I've constructed, and you'll see as I switch focus by moving left and right, it logs each time. So that's how you detect focus changes. Next thing I want to talk about is making a custom view of yours focusable. This is actually pretty simple. I would actually advise folks against doing this because, again, the tvOS components already have really nice visual effects built into this, but this is available if you want to make a custom view focusable. So to do that, you actually just override a method from UI focus item can become focused. If you return yes from that, the focus system considers your view to be focusable, and it can become the thing that is focused. And in this case, you basically use the did update focus in context method from the last slide to detect when focus changes. So I have a very simple example here where I created a custom class that is focusable, and when it becomes focused, it becomes red and large, and when it's out of focus, it's green and small. And here, as I move focus, you see it shifts back and forth. So pretty simple. Next thing is specifying preferred focus. So if you've worked in accessibility, this might be familiar to you. So in the accessibility system, as a screen changes, the screen reader begins reading elements. And so it picks an element on screen to start reading. And you indicate that using a protocol. I'm actually not 100% sure. But there's a very similar example in tvOS. So in tvOS, let's say you push a view controller onto the stack and you want one view to initially be focused. You want some element to be the thing that is initially picked up by the focus system. You override a method on UI focus environment to do that, to declare what the preferred focused view should be. And these can be specified like hierarchically. So you can have one view specify that one of its descendants can be the preferred focus view, and then that view can also specify that one of its children should be the preferred focus view. So you can specify it in a chain. Next is getting focused views. So what's kind of funny is that the UI focus item protocol does not have like a property or a method that is like is currently focused thing. That's not a part of like the pure focus system. However, UI view does have a property for that. So you can, for an arbitrary view, you can check is focused and it'll tell you whether or not it's focused. To get like arbitrarily get the current element that's focused, UI screen has a method for that. It's focused view. And my understanding with this is that Apple actually kind of doesn't want you to use this method. It's like almost discouraged. You can use it, but the thing is that the focus view is arbitrary in your view hierarchy. You have no idea where it is. So if you grab the screen's focused view and then begin assuming it's in a particular hierarchy or whatever, you're going to have a bad time. So I recommend using that with caution. I use it only a little bit in Tangent. Try to use it as little as possible. Now onto the components that tvOS gives you for free. So UI button, if you're an iOS developer, you probably know UI button. UI button has a specific type just for tvOS that gives it this nice styling. UI buttons also adopt dark mode by default, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. But if you need buttons with this appearance, which are very common in tvOS, I recommend just using a UI button and not reinventing the wheel. Next is image views. So one of the coolest demoed things in tvOS is this really nice parallax effect that image views have throughout the OS. So there's this nice shimmer that kind of shows up on top, and as you move your finger on the remote, the image actually kind of pans around. It's super cool that this is basically a one-liner. It's a property on UI image view that you set to yes. It's this adjusts image when ancestor focused, which is a mouthful. You set that to yes, and image views automatically adopt this behavior. What's a little bit I guess misleading at first about this API is that you don't actually make the image view itself focusable. And I actually haven't tried it, but I believe making an image view itself focusable doesn't pick up this effect. It's specifically when an ancestor is focused. So you have to set this property to yes, and then put the image view inside of another view that is itself focusable. So in this example, I've created an invisible view behind the image view that is actually focusable, but the image view gets the effect when it's focused, which is cool. This is like all over tvOS. I recommend doing this because it looks awesome. Next thing, so collections. And by collections, I don't just mean UI collection view, I mean UI collection view and UI table view. Both UI collection view and UI table view have extensions that are specific to tvOS that are all focus oriented. So everything I talked about earlier in this section about whether or not a thing can become focused, whether focus should update, if focus did update, where preferred focus should go, there are extensions that are specific to tvOS that have. So I would recommend using these a lot. This is actually 2 examples from my app Tangent. On the left, or on the right, excuse me, this is the settings page. That's just a super vanilla UI table view with text labels on it. Nothing crazy about that. And then this is a grid of posts from Instagram. This is just a collection view, and each of the collection view cells contains an image view with that property that I mentioned, set TS on it. So very bare bones, but you can kind of compose these things together and get cool effects. So you can use these to do a lot in your apps. And then finally, this is actually a super cool trick that a friend of mine who worked on tvOS told me about. There's a class called UI Focus Guide, which inherits from a class called UI Layout Guide that is available on iOS. UI Focus Guide is not available on iOS. But a focus guide allows you to, you basically inject focus guides into views, and you can set them up so that focus is redirected. So in this case, I've got this collection view full of cells, and by default, if I was to try to swipe up on this one, the focus system doesn't detect any views above it. So it would just stop there. But in this view hierarchy, if from any swipe up here, it kind of seems logical that the settings button would get picked up. So the way this is implemented is this is actually just a header view on the collection view, and I added a focus guide to it, and the focus guide has it redirects focus to the settings button. So that's how I achieve this effect. If you run into similar stuff where you're building a tvOS app and it's like you swipe and then focus sort of stops and you're like, oh, I wish it would jump to that thing, focus guides are a great way to do that. Next thing I want to talk about is gestures. So this is more of the same, more familiar stuff. So UI Gesture Recognizer, our old friend from iOS, is available on tvOS, and it has a few extensions that are tvOS specific, but it's a very simple API and pleasant to use. So first thing is the Siri remote has buttons, and you can actually pick up button presses on things. So this is an example where I, for example, want to make the play pause do something. You basically just create a UI tap gesture recognizer. This should be pretty familiar to everybody. There's an extension specific to tvOS, which is allowed press types. Allowed press types takes actually an array of NS numbers, which is really weird. I don't know why it's like not an enum or something like that. But you pass in the buttons that you want the gesture recognizer to operate on. For long presses, it's very similar. You just change the class. UI long press gesture recognizer works exactly the same way. Now you can get long presses on the play pause button. This is a list of all the allowed press types. So and this is just copied out of Apple's headers. Up, down, left, and right arrows. If you're using the classic Apple remote, not the non-Siri remote, the one that they've had for a while, up, down, left, and right map to those presses on those buttons directly. On the Siri remote, the new remote, a light tap on the top, bottom, left, or right of the remote, just like a gentle tap, also equates to these. So they are still used even in the newer remote. And then you can also get taps on the select button, which is like the main clicking the trackpad down in the middle, the menu button or the play pause button. Volume buttons, the home button, and the Siri button are all reserved. You can't use them. There might be a private API for that, but I haven't fiddled with it. And then swipes, this is literally indistinguishable from iOS code. There is no difference. You can just detect swipes. It's very simple. You use a UI swipe gesture recognizer. And it does get kind of funny if you build a view hierarchy that has a bunch of focusable elements and you're also using like swipe gesture recognizers. I get the feeling that there will be some strange effects if you do it that way, but you can experiment with it. Next thing I want to talk about is the top shelf. So if you build an Apple TV app that users love and they decide to put it in the top row of content on their Apple TV, when an item in the top when an item in the top row of icons becomes focused, this thing, which is called the top shelf, fills with content from your app. And this is specified by your app. So if you want to build a really compelling tvOS app, I really recommend that you implement one of these, because if people really love it, they'll want to see your content on their TV up here. So how do you implement one of these? These are implemented as extensions. So it's similar to the extensibility framework that exists on iOS, macOS, and watchOS. So basically, pragmatically, you create a new target and you select top shelf provider, and it actually writes a lot of this stuff for you that I've listed up here. But you create a class that conforms to this TV top shelf item provider or TV top shelf provider. And that really only does two things. It specifies a style. So there's two styles of top shelf that or of top shelf content that you can show. And then you provide just a simple array of content to be displayed. One handy thing about this is that if you want to flush the content that the OS has cached, for example, if your app has authentication, like my app, Tangent, has user authentication. If a user logs out, I don't want to continue showing the logged in content in the top shelf. So there's a notification you can post, and the OS picks that up and flushes the content out. Another example is account switching. So if you have an app that supports multiple accounts and you switch accounts, it's handy to post this so that the OS invalidates whatever it has up there. So getting into the details of this a little bit more, there's this class that you return from your top shelf extension called a TV content item. This is a lot of boilerplate stuff, and it's documented pretty well, but you construct a TV content item with an identifier. They created a dedicated identifier class just for TV content items. I actually don't know why they did that, because these things are not queryable. Like, you as a developer cannot get these later, and this content is pretty ephemeral. Like, as far as I can tell, tvOS flushes this content all the time, so I don't think it's caching them either. But nonetheless, you have to create these TV content identifier classes. But then you construct a TV content item with them, and then there's a bunch of properties you can set which configure how they're displayed. So first thing is you can set up an image URL, which is it has to be a remote image URL. You can't specify a local image, which is a bit unfortunate. But that is basically the image that will be displayed in the top shelf. These have an image shape property. Apple does not give you arbitrary aspect ratios for these things. They have a finite set, and those map to popular content types. Some of them are video, some of them are photo. But you can specify what aspect ratio the content is that you want. And what I actually did for Tangent with this is I actually wrote a method that basically maps arbitrary aspect ratios to the best fitting aspect ratio that they provide, and you could do the same. You specify a title. The title is displayed whenever an item in the top shelf is focused. And then there's two URLs you specify. These actually use app URL schemes, basically. If you don't know anything about app URL schemes, I recommend watching my other talk at NSMeetup from this past February. I go really in depth on that. But you specify two URLs that your app receives. One of these is for when an item in the top shelf is focused and the user taps the select button on it, it launches into that. So for an example of like movies, if a user focuses on a movie and clicks, it should probably go to like a summary of the movie. I think that's actually what the tvOS Movies app does. The other is a play URL. So if a user is focused on an item in the top shelf and they press the play button, there's a separate URL that you can provide that launches basically directly into playback. So in the movie example, you'd want to make it start playing the movie in that case. So you've created a TV content item. And then you have to kind of marshal these things into something that tvOS can use. So I mentioned that there's two styles of top shelf content. Those are specified through this top shelf style method. I'm going to start off with the section style, which in practice seems to be the more popular of the two. So you construct a method is called that basically queries your extension for content items. This is a blocking call, so if you need to do an asynchronous network request in here, you need to be able to basically block the method until you have the content, return it, which you can do with semaphores. But anyway, here you get a bunch of different content items, and then what's important to note for the section style, and this is not documented super well, I had kind of a headache finding this, but is that content items can actually have child items. So I've constructed a root item here, and the root item actually has children. For the section style, you have to provide content items in this way. If you just provide a bare array of content items, nothing will show up, which is really weird. You have to provide them in a hierarchy. And the hierarchy actually specifies the sections, which is where the sectioned name came from. So in this example, with my hypothetical 3 items, I've created an extension that has these 3 pieces of content. If you were to provide multiple root items for the section style and give titles to each one, you would get an effect like this. Again, I think the Movies app does this for if you've rented a movie recently and you focus on the Movies app, it says, this is the movie that you're viewing right now, and then the rest of the content is shown behind it. So this is an example where I've put these two items into a single root item and this item into a secondary root item and return them in that array. So for the other style, the inset style, which is more of full screen, it basically occupies the entire space of the top shelf, but is inset very slightly. There are no sections to this, so you can just return a bare array of content items, and they're all displayed one by one. That looks like this. I believe the App Store uses this, and there's probably a few other tvOS apps that use this, but it's basically like the content occupies the whole region, and you don't really have much of a say in the aspect ratio of the thing either. So that's top shelf. Next thing I want to talk about is dark mode. So tvOS 9, which was the initial version of tvOS, did not have dark mode, but Apple introduced it in tvOS 10. It looks like this. You can trigger it using the Siri remote, which hopefully the video starts. Video, hello. Please. Yes, there we go. Okay, so basically, if you're an Apple TV user and you have the Siri remote, you can hold down the button and say dark mode or say light mode, and it'll toggle back and forth between the two. You can also just go into the system settings and change it, but that's much more involved than just saying it. And I actually think this is really awesome, and if you want to build a super compelling tvOS app, you should build it as well, because people don't want to be like blinded by the whiteness when they're in their living room with the lights out for the most part. So it's good practice to adopt. This is it running in tangent. The way this works, it's actually pretty simple. There's an info plist value you need to set. If you're creating a new project for tvOS 10 or above, this is automatically set, so you don't have to do anything. But if you build an app that supports tvOS, or that used to support tvOS 9 and you're building for tvOS 10, you need to set it. It's this UI user interface style. If you set it to automatic, basically the app will pick up whatever the system says, whatever the system is set to. You can also hard code it to light mode or hard code it to dark mode if you want to build an app that only supports dark mode, and the OS will just forever stay stuck in that mode when your app is launched. A lot of the standard controls I talked about just automatically change, which is super handy. For example, buttons, which already are like very specialized in appearance, they will automatically invert colors in response to this, which is handy. I believe labels do as well. But for custom work, the main way you do it is through the trait collection API. So trait collection API basically propagates major changes in your view hierarchy through a method. I believe it's trait collection did change or trait collection will change. So UI trait collection in tvOS has a new property on it called user interface style, and this is light or dark, basically. So this is how you pick up changes. You override the UI trait collection method and you detect changes in this. A very fun gotcha when I was implementing dark mode is that I initially implemented it to support tvOS 9 still, and I used if response to selector. So I basically said, oh yeah, if response to selector user interface style, then like grab that value and use it to dictate what the style is. What's funny is it was undocumented, but in tvOS 9, UI trait collection did respond to user interface style. It was already there, and it returned basically a garbage value. Like in practice, you could call it, but it would return a random value. So when I was initially implementing this, whenever I ran it on tvOS 9, I just got like random view appearances. So I usually recommend using response to selector to check for API availability, but in this case, you should actually just check the OS version. That's the safest way to do it. Also, right around the time that tvOS 10 was coming out, I wrote a small utility that I tweeted about that does this for you. Basically, it does exactly what I'm describing, and it also has some handy stuff for diffing what the style is. So if you want a dark mode utility that is tvOS 9 compatible, you can check that out. And then this is also, as far as I can tell, not really documented, but there's a simulator shortcut that allows you to switch between dark mode and light mode really quickly. It's Shift-Command-D, super handy. It's faster than talking to the Siri remote. And then also, this is actually just a very brief summary of a really great dub talk that was given this past year by a guy named Marshall Huss, who works on UIKit for tvOS. And this is a link to that. If you want to know more about how dark mode works or UIKit and tvOS in general, I recommend checking that out. It's a good watch. That's how I learned how to do dark mode support. So the final thing is authentication. So if you're building a modern app, your user probably has to sign in to it. There's probably accounts of some sort. They might be accounts for a service that you own, or it might be accounts for a service that somebody else owns. But there's some complications with this in tvOS. So, like the other Tim said, the future of TV. The future of TV is apps. It's not the web. So UI WebView and WK WebView and SF Safari View Controller, all of our web friends, are not available on tvOS. You cannot use them. So if you have an app that has to do OAuth, you're in trouble. You have to find some other way to perform authentication. Even besides that, the keyboard is really cumbersome to use, and it's annoying for users to use, and the APIs for it are really bad. I conveniently do not have slides in here about how to use the keyboard on tvOS. I just glossed over that. If you want to read about how to handle the keyboard on tvOS, there's a link for it here in the bottom corner. But just don't make your users use the keyboard as much as possible. Like it's a horrible experience. This was like a meme when the Apple TV came out. Everyone was like, "Oh, gotta enter my password." So. What's convenient is that there are some solutions out there that people have built for you. So Twitter's Fabric has a really awesome utility called Digits. Digits is like an SMS-based authentication tool, and it works on tvOS. So you can use Twitter Digits to do auth on tvOS. If you need to do Facebook auth, Facebook has an SDK for tvOS. You can use that. I don't know if you can use this to do auth with arbitrary things, but it will definitely do Facebook authentication. And then right around the time that tvOS came out, there's a guy who works at a company in TimeHop, or a company named TimeHop that's in New York. His name's Benny Wong. He discovered it's kind of weird. Like handoff isn't available on tvOS, and like Bluetooth isn't. Like the Bluetooth APIs aren't really available. But you can actually use Bonjour to connect an iOS app with a tvOS app. He wrote a really interesting Medium post about it back at the time. This is a link to that. And in that post, he actually references an open source library that allows you to do iOS app auth to tvOS app auth using Bonjour. So if you have an iOS app and a tvOS app, you can use Bonjour to do it, which is kind of cool. I did not have the benefit of any of these even existing, nor could I have used them for Tangent when I was building it, because I have to do OAuth with Instagram. I don't have an iOS app. So I was like, well, how am I going to do this? So in that case, you could roll your own solution, which is what I did. So I'm going to talk about how authentication works in Tangent, piece by piece. I think that hopefully this is useful to other people if you end up in a similar situation. You can use the same pattern to build authentication into your app. So there's three actors in this. The first is my tvOS app, of course, Tangent, over here in the corner, which is awkwardly close to this thing now. There is a device that the user owns that has a browser on it. So this could be a Mac, an iPhone, an Android phone, like, I don't know, like a PC from the 90s, whatever it is. So a device with a browser, and then I had to build a server, which I am no good at, but got it working. This was running in Parse initially. I don't know if you guys have heard of Parse, but Parse is actually shutting down early next year. But they open sourced their stuff, so I migrated it to Heroku, and it's still running, and I still use the same system for doing it. So there's four main steps to this. The first step is when the tvOS app initially launches, it prompts the user to log in by giving them a URL, and it displays a PIN code. So you get a little PIN code, and it says go to a browser somewhere and enter this URL. In Tangent, it looks like this. Basically, launches, says go to this URL. Here is your PIN code, and I believe this is somewhat common on tvOS. I think like the HBO app does this, for example, as well. Next step is the user actually authenticates with the third-party service. In this case, it's Instagram for me. So there's this third-party server. It gets a token, and then that token is ultimately transferred to my server. So now I have an entry with this token in my server somewhere. And that looks like this. This is the Instagram login. Nothing too fancy about that. The next step is that on the device with the browser, it switches after authentication occurs and says, hey, enter that big PIN code that's shown on the TV, basically. And what that allows me to do is join the token with that PIN code. So that's effectively the user transmitting the PIN code to the server and me linking that token that I got before with that PIN code. So in my app, I'm not a web developer, so this is not exactly a beautiful form, but that's what it looks like. It basically asks you to enter the PIN code that you have. And the final step is the entire time this has been happening, the moment the app launches, I actually begin polling my server. So the client polls the server every 5 seconds, and it asks for, hey, do you have a token for this PIN? Basically, like every 5 seconds, like, do you have a token yet? Do you have a token yet?
And at one point, once this whole process is completed, this request will actually succeed, and the token is transmitted to the tvOS app, and then I am totally logged in. So at this point, I'm done. I want to talk a little bit about some security mindedness stuff with this. Let's see. So first of all, if you're building an API like this, you should have some sort of security gating it. Like your server should be really sure that the thing that's communicating with it is your client, or else basically malicious people could probably get the token from the server, which would be bad. You don't want that. So I have a security system here in place. If anybody wants to know more about it later, I can talk about it. There was something else security minded I wanted to talk about that I can't remember, which is bumming me out. Let's say the user cancels authentication. So like they get to step 3, and then they're just like, screw it, like I don't want this app. The thing that the token that's ultimately in my server, I don't want that. That's information that is sensitive because it's like somebody's authentication. So you should have some sort of an expiration on those. They should be purged from the server periodically. I don't hold on to tokens for more than 30 minutes. I even think that's a little long. It should probably be like 5 minutes, but yeah. So make sure if you follow this pattern that you do those things. In the end, you just wind up being logged in. Basically, the login screen just flashes and you're in the app itself. So you're done. Yay. One other thing that's kind of interesting to note about this is Apple, at least when they were initially reviewing tvOS apps, they were super strict about a lot of things. Like I got multiple rejections when I was trying to submit Tangent before tvOS came out for a bunch of really pedantic things. And one of them was initially the model was a little bit backward. The tvOS app didn't used to show a pin code. I actually used to show a keyboard, and the pin code would actually show up on the device with the browser, and you'd have to enter it on the TV. And that way, I didn't have to poll. It was just like a one-time thing. Apple rejected me for that. They were like, "Don't make people use the keyboard to authenticate. Like, you should do it a different way." So if you think you've found a clever way of like getting around this, like be cautious. And this was like the week before tvOS was, or the Apple TV was going to launch, and I was like, oh shit, I have to rewrite the whole server. Like the whole flow has to be a different orientation. So just something to be cognizant of. In summary, I have talked about the focus system, which is like the fundamental thing that you need to know about tvOS. I've talked about using gestures on tvOS. I've talked about top shelf, which is also key in building a great experience. I've talked about dark mode, which I think users are going to come to expect more and more over time. And I've talked about authentication, which I think will be valuable to a lot of folks in here. So with that, I would like to say thank you for having me. Appreciate it. And ask if anybody has any questions. Thank you. Thanks. Yes. That is a good question. I don't believe that it does, but I don't know off the top of my head. I don't think that it does. Yes. So in the betas, I would say yes. I can't remember off the top of my head, but like in the infancy of tvOS, when it was in the early betas, I filed radars like a mad person, basically. It is pretty consistent now, though. There's one issue that I know of, which is like super weird and elusive, where if you have buttons with transparency and you do like a navigation controller push in certain situations, there's like a weird visual glitch that happens with the buttons. And it doesn't happen in the simulator, as far as I can tell. But they seem pretty consistent. So yeah. That is a good question. I'm supposed to be repeating the question. So the question was, early on in the development of this app, when there wasn't that much literature out about it, like how did I find stuff? A lot of it was Stack Overflow. There was stuff on Stack Overflow already. Also, the developer forums were a little bit more like vibrant about it because it was like basically people that were like really close to it were like talking in the forums a lot. And yeah, I think that's mostly how I did it. Also, just like reading the docs, like Apple, they provide documentation on all this stuff. And actually, the headers are super useful. It's really weird when they initially launched tvOS. It was clear to me that like I think tvOS had existed for multiple years inside of Apple, and it was just like hidden under these macros. So before they shipped iOS, it would basically like hide a bunch of pieces of it. But there was this one macro that was all over the headers when the tvOS betas first came out. It was like something something hide tide. It was like TIDE, and I think that was the code word for tvOS. But you could find things that were tvOS specific by looking for those macros. Basically, it was like, oh, here's all the focus functionality like within this macro. That since is gone, but there's actually proper macros for that now. It's like tvOS prohibited or tvOS only or something like that. So you can like, if you look at the headers, you can identify what is specific to tvOS. Yeah. Yes. Yes, the question is, do I have any rules about side projects? So the big two rules, and I believe these are rules for the state of California, not just me, but are in order for you to not legally get in hot water, you have to work on them on your own time and on your own equipment. So I never work on these during working hours, and I never work on them on equipment that my employer owns. As far as what I do, it's usually just like a random thing that I'm like, oh man, that'd be so cool to build. So this app is kind of like, I don't know, I loved building this app. This was so awesome because I was like, oh, tvOS is out. Like, I wonder if I just wanted to fiddle with it basically. I was like, I wonder if I could show like Instagram photos in a grid one weekend. And it was like my first hack on the TV. And then my girlfriend was out of town the following weekend and I had a whole bunch of time. And I basically just like went to town. And then basically, like, I didn't sleep. Like, I went crazy and worked on it all weekend. And then by the end of it, I was like, I bet I could finish this thing by the time that the Apple TV actually launches. Like, I wanted to be a day one app on the tvOS App Store because I'd never done that with iOS or watchOS or anything, and so I got to do that, which was cool. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, it uses the same app transport security stuff that iOS does. So if you use the whatever it is, NS allows arbitrary loads or like all that stuff, that all exists on tvOS and it's exactly the same. So, um, so that's a good question. How do I manage push notifications on tvOS? So my app doesn't support them. In tvOS 9, there was no push notification system. That was one of the things that was disabled in tvOS. I believe they've reintroduced that into tvOS 10. So you can have push notifications in tvOS 10. And I haven't used that personally, but I bet it's exactly the same as the iOS system for doing so. And in fact, in iOS 10, there's a new framework for notifications. It's the UN notifications framework. It's probably exactly that. So that's how it works. So the question is, how do I manage the quality of the photos across a bunch of different screen sizes? So the resolution that the Apple TV outputs is only one. So that's all I get. It's basically 1080p. As far as managing the quality of the photos, the Instagram API outputs a bunch of different sizes. I tried to pick the appropriate sizes for the appropriate viewports. So in Top Shelf, it's like the highest quality. If you go into the details of a post in my app, it's also like the highest quality. In the grid, it's actually like an intermediate quality. So yeah, that's how I manage it. It does, but it's no more than on like an iOS device. And like I said, the hardware is like extraordinarily fast. So yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, have I used TVML? So around the time that tvOS was launched, there's not actually one way to build tvOS apps. There's two. What I talked about is the UIKit centric way of doing so, but there's also this markup language that I believe is just like XML, basically with certain tags called TVML to build apps, and it's way simpler to do, is my understanding. If you don't have a UIKit background, it's way easier to do. I have personally not used that, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer any questions about it. I believe that was a lot of the intention with that was for people who built apps for the older Apple TV. So like the Apple TV before it was like a real thing for Apple. They built apps using like this XML API that was all private. You had to be invited by Apple to use, and TVML resembles that quite a bit, but I haven't used it personally. Yeah. So again, my familiarity with it is pretty low, but I've heard it's actually remarkably flexible. I've heard good things about it. So yeah, yeah. Answer is you can create custom views. So cool. From someone who knows. Yes, I have not. The question was, have I worked with tvOS's Bluetooth capabilities? I know that they were somewhat hindered, like I mentioned in the slide where I talked about Bonjour. It's weird. You would think that handoff is like the perfect thing for tvOS or like multi-peer connectivity, and it seems like a lot of that is like disabled in tvOS for the most part. But yeah, yes. That's a good question. So you mean like in the context of like a scroll view? They are self-navigating, which I didn't talk about, but is very cool. So if you create like a collection view and focus shifts, the view automatically scrolls. The viewport automatically changes as you scroll through it. And I haven't fiddled too much with like overriding behavior with that. There was this one thing I wanted to do in Tangent where I tried to do it. I would basically like force it to scroll in a certain way, and it was like a total mess. So I don't advise trying to do that. But yeah, the viewports automatically change as you scroll. Yes. What do you mean by natural scrolling? Oh yes. So the question is, and this is sort of like historically a thing with the Mac and iOS. So like on iOS with touch input, as you move, the content moves down if you move your finger down. Whereas on the Mac, historically, if you use two fingers and scroll, the content would move up. Or I might have it backwards. It's always very confusing. But this has been a thing on tvOS where if you have full screen content and you put your finger down on the remote and swipe left, is it like are you moving the viewport or are you moving the content? Um, and you're correct. Like lots of people do it lots of different ways. I remember when tvOS came out, like people were like, "Oh, why does it do it this way?" or "Why does it do it this way?" I believe it's meant to act more like uh, something's going on. I believe it's meant more to act like iOS. So you're moving the content and not the viewport. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So my friend Nacho here makes an excellent point too, which is there are exceptions to what I just said, which is there's this class. Is it UI page view controller? Yes, where it works the opposite direction. You scroll it and it goes the other way. So if you use that class, behavior is a little bit different. Okay. Apparently, Apple recommends making your choice based on whether it's full screen or not. All right. And I believe that so Apple gave a series of tech talks about tvOS last year, and I believe that they're online for free, and so you could probably find the video on that in there somewhere. So, any other question? Yes. Yes, I like my app a lot. It's probably the one that I've used the most. I really like Flappy Bird. I didn't play Flappy Bird on iOS before tvOS came out, and I play it on the TV. Or I did for a while. It's sort of like so many popular games. I played it a lot for a while, and it sort of fizzled away. And then a lot of the big ones that Apple pushes, like I use Netflix a lot, of course, and like HBO. Those are really great. And YouTube is really good. A lot of what I use is very like video focused, of course, because the form factor is great for that. And that's actually part of why I'm talking here today, because I feel like there's a whole bunch of opportunity for apps that are not like owned by gigantic companies that have a ton of video content that I think could be created but aren't. So yes, mostly I use video apps. I use Flappy Bird a little bit and my app. So yeah, yes, yes. Somebody asked me before this before the talk, so I looked it up, which is good. So uh, yes, I get about 100 downloads a day on Tangent, and that's fluctuated with time. When it initially came out, what's funny about the tvOS App Store, like the App Store app on tvOS, is they didn't initially have categories. Like you couldn't browse apps by category because there were so few apps. Apple didn't want to be like, we only have 2 apps in the productivity category. So So initially, the exposure in the App Store was pretty low. Like you couldn't really find my app that easily. There was just like a top of all apps that you could browse through. Um, uh, so I initially got I don't know, it was like something like 50 or to 100 downloads a day when it first came out, and then late last year, or no, it was mid this year, Instagram shut off major components of their API, and when that happened, I updated my app to only show the components of the API I still had access to, and there was like a slow linear decline in my usage from that point on, and then tvOS 10 came out, and they did have categories, and Tangent was one of the most popular apps in the social networking category. And so my usage numbers jumped, or the download numbers jumped back up. And it was like 200 a day for a while, and now it's closer to 100. As far as retention, I don't monitor retention so much, but I do monitor like daily actives. And it's anywhere between like 500 and 700. It's like somewhere in that range. So yeah. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah. My pleasure. So the question is, are the core Spotlight APIs available? So that's like Spotlight indexing for devices. I don't think that's available on tvOS. I don't believe that's available. I don't think that you can hook into Siri search. But I don't know. I would take everything I say on this front with a grain of salt because I actually haven't tried to do that yet. But I remember in the beginning, in order for Siri to index your content, you had to be like an HBO or a Netflix or like one of the big ones. They might have opened that up more over time, but I haven't experimented with it. So, yeah. Any other questions? No? All right, cool. Thank you.